This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about story structure. Now, this is one of those topics I heard a whisper earlier that it can be kind of a dry topic. But it's
technical, right?
technical, maybe. I mean, I guess it's critical and useful. And I actually have a whole course called The Structure of Story at storyworksfiction.com. I'll just throw that out there. Because in working with coaching clients and editing clients, I kept getting the same question and I kept seeing the same problems over and over in manuscripts. Writers would say, how long should my scenes be? Or they wouldn't know how many scenes to put into a chapter. Or they would try to mimic an intense action thriller style with single scene chapters where they'd have 100 chapters in their book, but those scenes weren't supporting a chapter. They were not functioning as chapters, and people often have trouble with where to put a scene break, where to put a chapter break, how these things work together, what a hook really is. So there's so much to structure that we could talk about. So where should we start? What's your burning question about structure, if you have one?
Well, what is it? I mean, there's so many different ways to dissect. Are we talking about structure for people who outline? Are we talking about structure for people who want to revise and review where their book is sitting in terms of critical points in the story? I fear that we can overwhelm listeners because there's so much available for structure, and it can get a bit dry and technical.
Yeah, well,
So where would you start?
Structure, I would start by saying structure is the shape of your story. It is the frame of the house upon which you need to build everything. And, for long form fiction, for novels, novellas to novels, let's say, you're going to have a basic 3-act structure. And I know a lot of people really like the 4-act structure, but all that is putting an act break where the midpoint goes.
The midpoint is,
And, there's a beauty to the 3-act structure. It contains everything you need. And within that macrocosm, you've got the microcosm of chapters and scenes, which then reflect back the 3-act structure. So structure, it is the shape of story. You've got 3 acts. You can have 4 if you want them, but let's just stick with 3 today. And you put them on Freytag's pyramid on this nice arc. That is basically what structure it is. It is a conceptual way to think about long-form fiction so we can parcel it into manageable chunks. You've got Act 1, that's your introductions, your setup, your world building, bringing us up through the inciting incident. Okay, that launches Act 2. Act 2 is the rising action. Stakes and tension are moving upward toward the climax. Your protagonist, using full agency, is making choices that drag us through the story, using that friction with the antagonist, having revelations about personal issues, hitting that midpoint where, we change and we get to the top of Act 2. And that is the second inciting incident or point of no return, which launches the climax. Act 3 is nothing but the climax and the resolution. So it's a little difficult to discuss something visual, something that's graphic, orally, and just describe it. So Let me know if that helps or if it just muddies the water. But
No, I think
basically,
it does. I
there
mean,
it is.
I think where we can get stuck is in not the insistence, but the idea that there has to be something happening at a specific spot. And having just been through another fairly intense long workshop where we took apart some masterworks and looked at how they worked, and in particular where they contradicted perhaps an accepted story idea. And you look at, well, why did that still work? So I think you have to, in my opinion, you have to approach structure with the idea that as you say, from a house point of view, it's a foundation and a framework,
right?
And not something that's predicated. So if you get into the middle of the book and there's still not been an inciting incident, that's a problem.
Right.
But if it happens at 18% or 26% of the way through, who cares if it works? Then it's there. That's the main point.
Right.
It's there. And even in one of these masterworks we were looking at, the inciting incident could have been considered to be close to the midpoint, but because it was a story of great coming of age and worldview change, a substantial portion of the first part, there was a movie actually of the first part. And movies are a bit different, I think, in that respect. They can get away with more because of the visual element. There was a lot more establishing that was interesting.
Right.
And so you could kind of get away with the fact that it wasn't necessarily the great inciting incident, but that's an outlier again, I think. And, I've not really I've certainly never done any script writing, but you hear a lot of the time from people that have come from the script writing world, screenwriting into novel writing, and they're quite surprised by how much fluidity novelists have. Whereas in the screenwriting world, there's got to be a midpoint shift at 50%.
Right.
There's got to, in the first 30 pages, this has got to happen. It's just,
right.
Otherwise, they're not going to shoot it because they know
right.
what makes
well, that's a
commercial.
much more commercial endeavor. Whereas novelists, we work in our little bubble and we have a lot more freedom to tell the story we want to tell. And then, the commercial piece comes later. So if you don't understand story structure, if you're new to this, if you have those questions, you must get a handle on it. You need to understand the elements of story. They are established because they work. And then once you understand how story works, you can go off and do what you want to do and play with elements and create shifts in that structure that might be fantastically interesting. But if you just start writing and you go off into the weeds, you might have 20 pages of world building or 20 pages of idea exploration, and you're going to lose your reader on page 1 or 2 or 3. So where's the story? We need to be introduced to a character. We need to have a sense of time and place. We need to have some mounting intrigue so that we want to find out what's going to happen to this character. And once those introductions and setup are established, we need an inciting incident. We need to have a handle within about 25% of the page count on what kind of story this is. Where am I going if I keep reading this book? And am I going to enjoy being involved with the story? And enjoy, I use loosely because it might be a tense story, it might be an uncomfortable story, but intellectually riveting or, darkly fascinating or whatever that is.
Right.
Right.
Am I going to want to be a part of whatever I'm reading?
Right. So you need to understand that as a key of structure. I'm looking at Act 1. What am I giving my reader in Act 1? Okay. Protagonist, setting, intrigue, and something happens to the protagonist that is going to change her life and launch her journey through the plot, right? And that inciting incident is all about the main plot. So in Act 1, in the setup, the intrigue, we're learning about who, what, when, where, and why, right? What is this place? Who are these people? What kind of relationships do they have? Give us a sense of your character before the plot action is launched. Because we want to see if the inciting incident turns our protagonist's world on end. We need to have a sense of the before in order to engage with that journey.
I like the hero's journey reflection on that, where a protagonist goes from ordinary world to extraordinary world. Or in doing so, something that he or she have been ignoring up until now can no longer be ignored, or it's irreversible.
Right.
So it's impossible to go back. And I think what you're saying about that ordinary world, or show them, what happens before this thing that triggers the main plot of the story.
Right.
What I think as a reader, we're looking for is to attach to the character.
Exactly.
And they don't have to be particularly likable, but some things you've got to attach them for some reason. So if an incident happens too quickly at the start, where before we've done that, then a reader may not persevere, I think.
Right.
To some degree, that is also a little, I think, genre dependent. So in a thriller or a mystery, clearly there are things expected very close to the start because we expect to be whisked away on that journey. But that doesn't have to be the inciting incident. It's just going to be something that hooks you into the ordinary world.
Yes.
And then at some point, that's then going to transform into, holy moly, look what we've gone to now. And then I had one more thing I was thinking about there, which was to do with the attachment.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, Robert. So I think Star Wars, the first movie, gives us a really great example of this because you've got a strong opening hook with Princess Leia and Darth Vader, and that is not the inciting incident, and it's not the body of Act 1. That's the opening hook. It's really a prologue because we're not with our protagonist, Luke Skywalker. We're somewhere else. And Princess Leia is an archetype. She is the princess. She's all dressed in white. She is the damsel in distress. Darth Vader is also an archetype, but he is the black hat there to whisk the princess off to his dark lair and hide her. So opening hook, very strong opening hook, but we don't stay there with Leia and Vader because we don't care about Princess Leia yet. We come to care about her later, way down the road as we get to know her. We go to Luke's world, and he's this very relatable kid. Oh, he complains about doing chores. He'd rather hang out with his friends. He's just like any American teenage boy, right? So we get that introduction to the protagonist, to his world, to his family relationships. We get some intrigue. There are these drones. There's old Ben Kenobi up on the hill or whatever. And then we get the inciting incident at the top of Act 1. And that's when he comes home and the farm is torched and his aunt and uncle are dead. That's the event that turns his world on end and changes his life forever, launching his journey through the main plot. Right?
And it's a clever scene too, because it's irreversible. Like it's not going to bring them back to life. It throws something that's impossible to ignore, that there is this other power, and also hidden in there is what we don't yet know is that they're trying to track him down. They're trying to track the droids down, and so there's that sort of, it moves the plot forward as well. So you've got a scene doing triple duty at least.
Right, and that's one too where the audience knows more than the character because of the prologue. We saw Princess Leia put her message in R2-D2. We see Luke interacting with R2-D2, so we know, Luke is going to get involved with this thing that happened with the princess and the black hat. Right? So that's part of the intrigue. It's very exciting to know ordinary, relatable kid is going to end up in that mess. With the big bad who, breathes through the mask and kicks fallen soldiers out of his way.
Right. And then you also have that interaction with agency in the inciting incident as well, because even though this all happened to his world, he then makes the choice to move forward through it instead of just sitting in the corner of the house and crying about it, or whatever that reaction would be.
Right. And that is a key part of every inciting incident and agency. So if you haven't heard our agency episode, we'll link to it in the show notes. Even if your choices are not stated, they need to be present in the reader's mind. They need to be implied or just naturally understood. So Luke comes home, the farm is torched. What is he going to do? Well, we know he's got to go back to Obi-Wan Kenobi and engage in this hero's journey. But he doesn't know that at that moment. So what could Luke see as his choices, right? Rebuild the farm, join the army, run away with friends, or go back, hang out with Obi-Wan Kenobi, see what happens. So he doesn't need to sit down and go, what should I do now? Should I A, B, C, or D? But the reader understands, because we had that introduction to his life before the inciting incident, that there are other things he could choose. It's not hard to imagine them. So they've been established, even if they're only implied.
Right.
Yeah, and he makes a choice that takes him out into the extraordinary world as well. So it's, again, following that classic hero. I mean, it's suggested that Spielberg deliberately wrote the thing to a classic hero's journey anyway. Whether he did or not is not the point. It's an extraordinarily great example where, as you say, he had lots of choice. Some of those would have involved still have been courageous. He could have chosen to stay there, bury his relatives, rebuild, forge on, make himself a better man because of it. But no, he's gone into the dark. He's still some aspect of him that's got that insatiable curiosity. So there's some elements of theme and personality that have driven that agency.
Right. And, Spielberg didn't invent the form, neither did Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell
exactly.
Wrote about something that is archetypal, that exists throughout narrative, through, all of time. So it's important that we understand what story structure is so that we can then work with it in our own stories. And you don't have to be writing a hero's journey to use elements of the structure. In the Skog Hall books, I open with a prologue in which we see the death, the murder of the victim who becomes the ghost. So that's very much like Leia and Vader. And I was not thinking of that when I chose to write it that way. It's just these story elements are so innate, they become kind of bred into our consciousness, and then I bring the protagonist, do the introduction, the setup, and the inciting incident is something that brings the protagonist, forces Jess to engage with what we saw in that prologue, with that murder, launching the ghost story, murder mystery part of the book. So when you understand the purpose of Act 1 and how you can use it, you apply those structural elements to any story in any genre, with or without prologues, with any kind of opening hook, any kind of inciting incident. And that's what we need to keep in mind. It's not trying to be formulaic. It's giving us tools.
Yeah, it's foundational, isn't it? I like to think about it as that first act is all about, as you say, establishing the situation and then kicking them off on the journey, whether it's a hero's journey or however you like to talk about it. In the middle act, I do like to split that into two halves. I'm still happy to call it Act 2, but definitely the first part of that seems to all be about the protagonist battling what this new situation is, and possibly even coming to points where they think they're succeeding, but it becomes later evident that they don't. And I really like the idea, and I think this comes from movie directors, where that midpoint shift is the, and I forget who it was who said it. Maybe it was either Lucas or Ridley Scott or Spielberg or someone of great standing said, if you don't have something that turns the movie on its head in the middle, it's never going to work. And that was interesting. I thought, okay, well, lots of stories don't necessarily do that as dramatically as that. But there probably is a point where I like, in my stories, the protagonist to start getting a handle on things and realize that they actually don't have their crap together. but they've got to now draw on their agency a lot more than maybe they were in the first half of the book, so that the second half of Act 2 then becomes much more about them trying to take control and then coming to the ultimate point of failure when you enter Act 3, and at some point you're going to have those all is lost moments or whatever. But then Act 3 should all be about the protagonist drawing everything together and doing everything they can to achieve what it is that they're after in the story, including defeating the antagonist.
Yes.
So at a broad level, that's how I like to think about it anyway.
Yeah, I think I'm not a huge fan of the midpoint issue. It makes perfect sense in a movie.
Yes.
Bully for film, that's awesome. Movies tend to be made from short stories to novellas. Novels are a much more expansive form than film. So, you're condensing things into a different package when you make a movie from a novel. And the midpoint is one thing that I do feel can get formulaic. It can be a very useful tool. It depends on how the writer looks at it and uses it. So I'm not saying don't have a midpoint, don't think about midpoints. I'm just saying be careful that you don't try to hinge your story on a midpoint. What I like to do is look at the body of Act 2 and examine the stakes and tension, the agency, and the motivation. And as the plot movements, those conflicts become increasingly difficult for the protagonist, the stakes go up, there's more to gain or lose. What is keeping my protagonist engaged in all of these difficult situations and preventing her from walking away? And so there are a series of moments when she's got to make those hard choices. And maybe one of those moments is big and more significant than the others, and maybe it falls at about the 50% mark. But maybe not. This is an expansive form, and, I want to have movement organic to my story and consistent motivation and agency throughout Act 2. I don't want to focus my attention on that construct of the midpoint, because it might limit me. It might kind of put blinders on me to other aspects necessary through Act 2.
No, I'm coming to agree with you there. I think there's, I like the idea of it because you can construct some dramatic elements around it. But if it's the only reason you're writing Act 2, then there's something missing. And I'll go back to, again, the things that we were looking at with Sean Coyne, and I repeatedly asked questions about the midpoint shift, and he basically just, I don't really care about it. I get pretty much the same thing. Yes, in movies it might be a big thing, but he's pretty much all about beginning hook, middle build, ending payoff, which is what he calls the three acts
structure. Yes,
and asking yourself if it works, and are you following the foundations of a scene, basically? Are the core elements of every scene there? Is it driving the story forward? Is it progressively getting more complicated for the protagonist?
Right.
And at the end of the book, are we finding ways to resolve that? And you don't necessarily need, and this is what I was saying earlier on about you're getting hung up on this has to happen at 18.5%, and this has to happen at 25%. And, it can get, and I used to be like that. But that isn't quite right. It should have happened a couple of thousand words ago, but I'm very analytical when it comes to especially my revision process. So I've graphed things out visually. I've done what the way you first talked about it. I like doing that.
Me too.
But you've got to be careful not to rob yourself of the emotional impact of the story.
Right. And when I graph my story, I don't do it to see if I'm hitting markers. I do it to see if I am consistently building the arc that I envision for my story. And that. So you want to look at your 3 acts and say 25% is Act 1, 50% is Act 2, 25% is Act 3. But that's just a guideline.
Yeah.
And depending on how tightly things move and what your pacing is, or how, reflective or whatever. Give yourself room for that to kind of float around a little bit. But if your inciting incident is a major life-changing event, like someone dying, or, a car crash, or a massive breakup that breaks your protagonist's heart, you probably don't want it at 35 or 40% of your book. Yeah. You want to, get that journey launched.
Yeah, well, I mean, you go back to your analogy or the metaphor of the house. You can innovate a house. Definitely, you can say, okay, I'm going to build it all on one level, or I'm going to build 12 stories straight up. But you're always going to have a roof at the top, and you're always going to have a foundation at the bottom. Right. You can't build a house on a roof. But if you are, say, if I were to build a house on a roof, what would I need? Or it would be subterranean. Okay, so if I'm going to do it, I'm still going to need a foundation, but it'd be subterranean. So the innovation still has to come from, I think, what our general expectations are around story.
Yeah, that's a great point, Robert. And I like how you used the building the house metaphor, because there are plenty of stories where you can jump around in time or location, but ultimately you still need to take the reader on a journey that starts with introductions and setup and ends with some kind of climax. And what you do in between can vary greatly.
Yeah, and if an author is brilliant at seducing the reader with oh my God, what's going to happen next? If that's all you're ever thinking when you're reading a book, who cares about structure? Right. They've managed to suck you in, and we've all done that, I think, as both editors and story nerds, where you think, I'm going to read this book and see, how it is that it's really structured. Then you get halfway through it and you've lost yourself for 4 hours. You go, oh, holy moly, what was the inciting incident? I've got no idea. I'm just sucked in.
Right.
And that's the mark of great writing, is that it doesn't matter what the structure is. You've attached to the character and you want to know what happens next. And, whether that's just zapped you back in time, those who are able to write great flashbacks do it because we wanted to know what happened, not because the flashback needs to be there because we just wanted to show the world.
Right. Yeah, but the structure is still there. It's like if you walk into a beautiful house, you don't think about the studs behind the drywall. You're just looking at the paint job or the wallpaper or the art on the walls. So as writers, if you read one of those books where you're sucked in and loving it, go back and ask yourself about the structure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You'll probably be amazed.
and that comes back to when you first opened up the podcast, talking about, it's important to know structure. And my argument against that would only be that if somebody, this comes back to the write what you know. And I don't mean that in a sense of write what you know in the real world. I mean, if let's say, murder mystery inside out, or you read Cozy's day in, day out, you're going to have an intuitive sense of what has to be in that type of story and when it has to happen. And it isn't necessary for you to, as an author, to be able to label that. So, this is Act 1, this is Act 2, Act 3. If you're dead set certain that you could write something that's as compelling as that, then certainly at first draft level, don't necessarily listen to us and get caught up and go, oh, no, but what did I have the inciting incident? If you know that genre inside out, there's a good chance you already have an intuitive understanding of story. Right. It's definitely a useful tool when it comes to self-editing and improving your craft.
Right. Well, I would say
don't let it put you off writing, if you don't know anything about it.
No.
You don't have to study story structure before you get words on the page.
No, that's certainly true. And there are lots of people who have an understanding of structure because of being avid readers all their lives.
Yeah.
But having worked with lots of clients, I can tell you many writers sit down to write because they have this great story in their head.
Yes.
And they have a character, they have a place, they have a theme, but they don't really understand how to put it into a novel format. And so this is where getting a sense of structure, studying it a little bit will just help you build your story. So, but definitely write, enjoy, have fun. But if you're struggling to end your chapters, or you don't know what the element is that's pulling a reader through a scene because you aren't sure how to identify tension, then you definitely need to look at story structure.
That's when you reach for it. Most definitely. Yeah, I totally agree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kathryn, do you have any final thoughts?
I know, right?
Yeah, Robert and I have been yak.
I think structure has a great I love using it in my outline space in order to evaluate whether or not my story is working to begin with. And then once I have that, okay, I have an inciting incident, I have my rising action, I have things going on, I have this climax, then I tend to try and forget it while I first draft, so that I just kind of write to a general point, and then I can go back and look at, oh, hey, look, here's 20% or here's, whatever. But like you say, Robert, don't pin yourself down to, I must have 12 scenes between the first word and my inciting incident. But I think it's a great way to start your story so you know where you're going to begin with. And that's the way I love to use it.
I agree, Kathryn. I think that's a great piece of advice to end on. So I would just encapsulate that and say, understand structure, use it when you build your storyboard or your outline, and then free yourself to write. Just put it in the back of your mind, trust it's there, write, and then go back to that structural piece, that outline, and do a little analysis as you go into revision.
Definitely.
Cool. All right. Not too boring, Robert. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.